the exact speed, heading, and altitude of the Russian aircraft, and that data was now perfectly aligned for an AIM-120D AMRAAM shot. He held that lock for 5 full seconds. 5 seconds. Not long enough to cross the legal threshold into a launch, but more than long enough for the Russian commander to understand exactly what had happened. He was dead if NATO chose to make him dead. His countermeasures were obsolete. His sensors had failed him. His wingmen were exhausted and confused, and the aircraft targeting him was still invisible. The only reason he remained alive in that sky was because an Italian pilot and the alliance behind him had chosen restraint over destruction. It was not just a tactical defeat, it was psychological checkmate. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on September 19, 2025, inside Estonia's hardened Air Operations Center, a radar operator watched 3 hostile contacts suddenly appear on his screen. These were not civilian jets. They were not routine transport flights crossing the Baltic. These were 3 Russian MiG-31 Foxhound interceptors driving straight into NATO's air defense identification zone near Vainloo Island. They were flying high, fast, and with complete intent. Their transponders were off, their radios were silent. This was no accident and no navigational mistake. It was a deliberate provocation, carefully designed to test how fast the alliance would react. The 3 heavy interceptors settled into a pattern that placed hundreds of thousands of Estonian civilians directly beneath their flight path, daring NATO to make the next move. But what the Russian pilots did not realize as they stared out through their canopies over the freezing Baltic was that they had already been found, they had already been tracked, and they were already being hunted. 2 Italian F-35A stealth fighters assigned to the Baltic air policing mission had been watching them since the moment they lifted off from their base. The Italian pilots did not even need to switch on their main radars. They were using the F-35's distributed aperture system and advanced infrared sensors to detect the huge heat signatures pouring out of the Russian engines against the icy upper atmosphere. And once you understand how the MiG-31 Zaslon radar works, you begin to see why the Foxhound pilots were flying blindly into a digital ambush. The MiG-31 was built for another era. It was a Cold War machine designed to detect large bombers crossing vast Arctic distances. Its radar relies on enormous power output, blasting electromagnetic energy across the sky. In practical terms, that means it announces its own presence to every passive receiver for hundreds of miles. The Italian F-35, by contrast, is built around the exact opposite philosophy. Its radar cross-section is so tiny that to older systems it is barely distinguishable from background noise. As the Russians swept the sky with maximum radar power, the stealth fighters simply absorbed and redirected that energy, remaining effectively invisible. At the same time, NATO's integrated air defense network was combining satellite imagery, ground-based radar data, and the passive sensor feeds from the F-35S into one seamless operational picture. Controllers on the ground could now see the Russian formation's exact altitude, speed, and heading in real time, all without transmitting a single active targeting signal that might reveal the trap. The imbalance was total. The Russian pilots were operating through brute force and legacy systems. The Italians were fighting through a silent network of information, able to shape the engagement before it truly began. And yet the real objective of this Russian maneuver was even more dangerous than aerial intimidation. The Foxhounds were not there just to provoke Estonia or test NATO response times. They were providing top cover for a vessel moving slowly below them through the crowded Baltic waters. NATO operators were actively tracking a Gabon-flagged commercial oil tanker known as the Jaguar, using synthetic aperture radar to monitor its exact movement through the maritime corridor. Within intelligence circles, this ship was already well known. It was part of a shadow fleet used to evade sanctions and quietly move Russian crude oil onto the global market. Its cargo represented millions of barrels of smuggled oil and a critical financial artery for a sanctioned state. The presence of 3 Russian heavy interceptors above it was not symbolic. It was a military escort, intended to discourage any attempt by European maritime authorities to interfere. So this confrontation was never only about airspace. It was about the merging of economic warfare and military deterrence. NATO's stealth fighters were watching a sanctions-busting operation unfold from above, recording radar imagery and tracking every movement, while Russia used one of its most formidable interceptors to shield illicit cargo from interference. It was geopolitical chess at 30,000 feet above the freezing Baltic Sea. Inside the Russian cockpits, the pressure began building quickly. Their radar warning receivers, based on older threat recognition logic, started chirping with vague, fragmented signals. They could sense faint bursts of electromagnetic activity in the airspace, but they could not determine what they were, where they were coming from, or how close the threat really was. The F-35s were positioned perfectly in their blind zones, Using highly directional data links that leaked almost no detectable energy, the Russian pilots knew something was there. They just had no idea what. Then, at exactly 9:12 in the morning, the lead Italian pilot decided it was time to make his presence felt. He keyed his radio on the International Guard frequency and issued a calm, direct order for the Russian aircraft to immediately leave sovereign airspace. The Russian flight leader responded almost at once with what sounded like a rehearsed denial, claiming his formation was simply conducting a scheduled navigational transit. That reply proved one thing very clearly. The Russians were fully aware of the communications environment. They were not lost, they were choosing to stay. But the radio call changed the psychology of the encounter. The Russian pilots now knew with certainty that they were being watched by an enemy they still could not see. Desperate to regain control of the situation, the Russian flight leader went to a classic Cold War tactic. He shoved the stick forward and sent his aircraft into a steep dive toward the sea, trying to bury the massive MiG-31 inside the clutter of radar reflections bouncing off the waves below. Decades earlier, that might have worked. Surface clutter once overwhelmed targeting systems and made low-altitude tracking extremely difficult. But against the F-35's active electronically scanned array radar, it was hopeless. The stealth fighter's processing power easily filtered out the noise from the ocean, isolating the Foxhound's velocity and tracking it cleanly through the descent. Realizing the dive had accomplished nothing except waste precious fuel, the Russian pilot reversed hard. He pulled into a steep climb and lit both afterburners, blasting back toward the upper atmosphere. It was an impressive display of raw power, but in a modern fight it was a disaster. The moment those engines went into full afterburner, the rear of the aircraft turned into a giant infrared flare. On the Italian pilot's helmet displays, the MiG's heat plume burned like a beacon. They followed it effortlessly, never once needing to emit a radar pulse. At that point, the Italians moved from passive dominance to active disorientation. They engaged the F-35's electronic warfare suite, the Barracuda system, and began turning the Russian radar picture into a nightmare. Barracuda does not just jam signals with noise, it captures enemy radar pulses, manipulates them with microscopic delays and shifts, and feeds them back as false returns. Inside the Foxhound cockpits, the radar displays suddenly descended into chaos. Empty sky was now filled with phantom contacts. 1 second there were 12 targets converging on the Jaguar. The next second there were none. Then suddenly 20. Threats appeared from impossible directions, vanished, and reappeared again. The Russians were no longer fighting aircraft. They were fighting an artificial reality. The confusion spread rapidly through the formation. The pilots began trying to cross-check targets with one another, struggling to determine what was real and what was fabricated. But their processors, built for another generation of warfare, could not keep up. The F-35s were not merely hiding anymore, they were rewriting the electromagnetic battlefield in real time, breaking the Russians' decision-making cycle without firing a shot. And just as the Russian leader was trying to make sense of the deception, the geometry of the fight changed again. To the south, Swedish JS-39 Gripen fighters that had been quietly holding position suddenly switched on their pulse Doppler radars at full power. Unlike the Italians, the Swedes wanted to be detected. The instant those radar beams hit the MiG-31 says, the Russian warning receivers changed from uncertain chirping into a steady, urgent scream. This was no longer a vague threat. This was a confirmed radar lock from a visible European fighter force. The brilliance of the trap now became obvious. The Swedes were fully tied into NATO's tactical network, receiving targeting geometry from the invisible F-35s above. If the Foxhounds turned south to engage the highly maneuverable Gripens, they would expose their engine exhausts and rear aspect to the stealth fighters behind them. If they stayed on course, they would fly deeper into the Gripens' engagement envelope. They had been boxed into a kill zone by a multinational force operating like a single organism. 3 isolated Russian interceptors were now trapped inside a coordinated Allied web. And still, NATO was not done. Across the Baltic region, automated scramble alerts were already setting a larger response into motion. Polish F-16 Fighting Falcons launched and began climbing north at full power. German Eurofighter Typhoons roared into the air, bringing supercruise speed and advanced AESA radars with them. This was not a local reaction anymore. It was a theater-wide activation. NATO's reinforcement machine was coming alive. What made it even more devastating was the efficiency. Ground controllers did not need to guide every aircraft through long radio calls. The digital network assigned vectors, altitude blocks, and tracking responsibilities automatically. Every fighter entering the battle space was plugged into the same shared picture. Meanwhile, the Russian pilots, still lost in phantom contacts and warning tones, had no idea that a major portion of Northern Europe's combat air power was converging on their exact location. That is one of the defining truths of modern air combat. A lone threat, no matter how fast or intimidating, cannot survive against a fully integrated multinational kill web once its situational awareness collapses. Then came the moment that nearly pushed the confrontation into open war. One of the Russian wingmen, rattled by the radar locks and the rising pressure, made a disastrous move. He banked sharply east, swinging the nose of his heavily armed interceptor toward the densely populated Estonian capital, Tallinn. In an instant, what had begun as a show of force over a sanctions-running tanker became something far more serious. An armed Russian aircraft was now pointing toward a sovereign European capital. Inside NATO command centers, threat algorithms immediately flagged the maneuver as an imminent strike profile. This was precisely the kind of escalation Article 5 exists to deter. The Russian pilot may have believed he was simply breaking away from the radar pressure, but in doing so, he had crossed the most dangerous line in the encounter. He had given NATO every tactical and legal reason it needed to destroy him. The Italian F-35s answered with extraordinary precision. They did not respond with missiles. They responded with control. Using a technique fighter pilots often refer to as herding, they exploited the Russian pilot's survival instincts. The lead Italian fighter, still invisible to every Russian sensor, briefly switched on his targeting radar for a single second and painted the Foxhound's left side with a focused beam of electromagnetic energy before vanishing again. Inside the Russian cockpit, the threat receiver screamed from the left, creating the immediate impression that a missile shot was about to come from that direction. Instinct took over. The Russian pilot slammed the stick right, banking away from the perceived threat, and in doing so, turning his nose away from Tallinn. The instant he completed the turn, the second F-35 lit him up from below, forcing him to climb. The stealth fighters were now using short, terrifying flashes of radar energy to physically shepherd the MiG away from the city. They were controlling his movement, shaping the airspace, and neutralizing a lethal threat without firing a single round. It was dominance of the purest kind. But every violent maneuver came with a cost, and that cost was fuel. The MiG-31's powerful Soloviev engines are notoriously thirsty, especially in afterburner. By this point, the Russian pilots had been diving, climbing, banking, and accelerating under constant pressure for what felt like an eternity. They had burned massive amounts of fuel in a battle where they had never even managed to target the enemy. At the rate they were consuming kerosene, they had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time left before the laws of physics would take over. Their home base at Kaliningrad was still far to the south, and sitting between them and safety were the Swedish Gripens. The Swedes now tightened the noose. They did not just maintain radar lock. They activated the data links for their Meteor beyond visual range missiles. And that changed everything. The Meteor is not a conventional missile that burns hard and then glides. Its throttleable ramjet allows it to preserve energy all the way to impact, maintaining lethal speed and maneuverability deep into the engagement. In practical terms, that creates a huge no-escape zone. Once the Russians were inside it, any aggressive move became mathematically suicidal. Then the final psychological blow landed. From a high-altitude position of complete invisibility, the lead Italian F-35 switched from passive tracking into a concentrated single-target track on the Russian flight leader. Inside the MiG-31 cockpit, the warning system changed from a chaotic stream of tones into the one sound every combat pilot dreads most, the solid, uninterrupted scream of a weapons-quality firing solution. The Italian pilot had done the math. He had the